When working with ACI, there's a few new terms that we need to learn. For instance, we can divide the physical fabric up into individual logical networks. This is different than a VDC. In a VDC, we divided one physical switch up into multiple logical switches. In this case, we're taking the whole network and we're dividing it up into individual logical networks with different access to different resources. And these networks could be, for instance, a production network and a backup network, or a production and a DMZ, or they could be an HR network and an accounting network. But however we divide these up, we separate them with a term that we call tenants. And a tenant could be a completely different company running on the ACI network, or it could be a separate business unit, or even just a separate group. Another term that we talk about on the ACI network is a term called contexts. A context is similar to a VRF in a traditional network. So normally with a Nexus device, we have two separate routing networks. We have a default data network, and we have a management network. All of our management traffic goes over that management VRF, and all of our normal data traffic goes over the default VRF. In this case, when I create a tenant, I have to create at least one VRF or context. I can create more than one if I would like. For instance, in this example, if I want to separate out the different networks that I'm creating underneath a single tenant, or I could just have a single context. There's another new term inside of ACI called a bridge domain. And I like to think of bridge domains as a container for subnets or IP space. Now what we do in ACI is we take devices and we put them in groups. These groups are called endpoint groups. For instance, endpoint group A and endpoint group B. When we take them and put them in these groups, they still have to be able to access their traditional networking structure, and they still need to get to things like their default gateway. And that's where the bridge domain comes in. Underneath a bridge domain, I can put a subnet or a default gateway, and a bridge domain controls how layer 2 acts for a certain set of devices that I associate with that bridge domain. It also contains the subnets that the groups I put underneath that bridge domain and the default gateways that the groups I put underneath that bridge domain can use. So for instance, the devices in EPG A and EPG B, or group A and B, can both use the default gateways associated with subnet A and B. I can put any devices from subnet A and B in either EPG group A or EPG group B. And I can have a single bridge domain underneath a context, or I can have multiple bridge domains underneath a context. But if I take this one step further, and for instance I create a separate bridge domain with a separate subnet and a separate default gateway, and then I create a group of devices under that default gateway, they will only be able to use the default gateway for subnet D. Now later on, I'm going to take these groups of devices and I'm going to control how they talk to each other through the use of a contract. But the first thing I would like you to understand is some of these basic concepts such as tenant or group or customer or business unit, and then context, which we have to have at least one VRF, bridge domain, which again we have to have at least one bridge domain, and that bridge domain is going to contain our default gateways for the groups that we put underneath that bridge domain. And then we're going to control how those groups talk to each other through the use of a contract. Please join me for our next lesson, 10.2, Understanding Tenants, EPGs, and Contracts.